Well, my name's Peter Conway, and at the point of 1978, having worked as a youth arts worker between 1974 and 78, I became the Principal Arts Officer for the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. Now, 1977 was a watershed year for the arts in Tower Hamlets, because the arts, we were very fortunate that the then leader of the council, Paul Beasley, was an advocate for using culture and the arts for change. And he was, if I say at that particular time, remembering we're talking about the early 70s, he was quite radical in his views, because the Labour Party at that time in Tower Hamlets was very old school. Came out, obviously you need to look at the period of the 30s, 40s, 50s with the docks, and many of the politicians were dockers or ex-dockers, and they had a very old school attitude to, let's say, development. And then this young man came in and took over as leader of the council, together with a very progressive but older chief executive called Jack Wolkind. But between the two of them, they made sure that the arts and culture were put centre stage in terms of the overall development of Tower Hamlets. So when I came into Tower Hamlets in 74, and I set up the Half Moon Young People's Theatre with my colleague Murray Edmond from New Zealand. And then I was taken on board by ILIA to run youth arts workshops, and we developed what was called a youth arts team called the ILIA A team, which later became the ILIA A team. And we would go around all the estates in Tower Hamlets and would run workshops in photography, in drama, in music, and we became, the work was brilliant work. Anyway, in 1977, under the then arts officer, Phil Shepherd, who had come from the Bath Arts Workshop, Phil galvanized the local community, and we put on a project at the Whitechapel Art Gallery called the Tower Hamlets Arts Project Show, THAP, T-H-A-P. Very much trying to get all areas of the community involved in a month-long show, not only visual, but music, dance, all sorts of things in the Whitechapel Art Gallery. And it was a huge success. And it really laid the paving stones or the groundwork for everything that then followed. Because the Tower Hamlets Arts Project show, THAP show, had a community arts bias. And I subsequently went on to become the chairman of GLAR's, Greater London Arts Community Arts Panel. So Tower Hamlets, I would argue, was one of the boroughs that was forging the way in using community arts to develop change, not only social change, but political change within the borough. So after the 1977 big show, we established a community arts bookshop called the THAP Bookshop in Watney Street Market. And then Phil decided to resign. He wasn't cut out for the bureaucracy of local government life. So while he came with a great deal of passion for the art, the bureaucracy was something that started to grind him down. And they advertised the post, and I didn't think of applying for it. I wanted to continue what I was doing, but I think they interviewed twice and didn't fill it. And then Paul Beasley approached me and said, would I be prepared to consider applying for the post? So I did indeed apply for the post, and I did get it. And I became arts officer in 1978 and stayed until 1988, when the Lib Dems came in and they targeted me and Paul Beasley, but with me as an officer being so closely connected with the leader of the council, I knew it was my time to get out and resign, which I duly did in 1988. But that 10 years was the most fascinating 10 years in terms of arts development within what was what still is a working class community with a high level of immigration from, you know, the Jews, the Huguenots, and now the Bangladeshis and the Somalis. And so it was a melting pot of creative ideas, cheap warehouses, cheap housing, a lot of squatting. And what happens in those circumstances is creatives move into those kind of areas. And we positively, as a council, welcomed creatives moving in. But you also had, at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, you had Nick Sirota taking over the Whitechapel Art Gallery, and then he went on to become head of the Tate. You had people like Chris Bond and Rob Walker at the Half Moon Theatre. You had so many names that were either living in the area, moving into the area, Ray Cooper of Elton John's band. But there was a big community arts movement being developed as a result of council policy, as a result of the work that I did, and as a result of educating the local councillors to the effectiveness of this particular approach. So between 1978 and the early 80s, when Fergus Early approached me, I would think it was around 83. So I'm now well set in. I'm 5 years into my tenancy of the council. I've got very, very clear ideas about what we want to do, about how we use culture and how we use arts, how we use derelict buildings. You know, it was really, really important. You have already had an artist colony down at Wapping, and this is a visual arts colony, but it was joined by all sorts of other people in Wapping, so that there was already a visual arts colony down there. But when the Chisenhale building became free, not only did Chisenhale Dance look at it, but Chisenhale Art and other artists started to move in it. And it became a real centre in the northeast of the borough in Bow for creative activity. Now, what I loved about Fergus, when Fergus came and explained, I mean, you know, he came out of X6 down at Butler's Wharf, and what he brought with him, I would argue, he brought two wings to his work. One which was definitely experimentation within the dance world, but the second thing is it had a community or educational bias to it. So that was really, really important. And that's the angle that really Chris and Mary then developed with, they came onto the Tower Hamlets Arts Committee. We funded a lot of their workshops, etc. So I probably spent more time with Chris and Mary than I did with Fergus, but I really do, you can't take away Fergus's impact in the development of Chisenhale Dance. We didn't really have, apart from the London Youth Dance Theatre, which was based in a school in near Whitechapel, but was doing really exciting work in terms of contemporary dance. But Chisenhale, with a very, you know, clear focus on contemporary dance, fitted our plans because it was in Bow, which was an underrepresented part of the borough in terms of the arts, because many of the things at that time were developed around Aldgate, Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and then more into Stepney or on the Isle of Dogs. Bow had very little going for it. It had a theatre called the Poplar Theatre, where in 1977 we managed to put on the Jam as one of their very first concerts, and so we started to use that venue for much more artistic activity away from what I would call the entertainment crackerjack style of entertainment the council originally did. So Chisenhale and the whole building of Chisenhale was really, really important in terms of that cultural, community, social development in that part of the borough. And what I loved about Chris and Mary is the work they did. In many ways, they took what the Ilia A team were doing way back in 74 to 78 and working in youth clubs, working on estates. They were taking that work back out. And so it chimed with me what they were doing, but I also knew the impact that that work would have, particularly on young people. Because if you can get the young people early into understanding, working with, art and culture and other things, that's where change really happens. That's where long term, if you can open the eyes of young people to the arts, and I use the arts in their widest term, then the future will look good. They will carry that through to the end of their life. In the bigger picture, so I'm seeing the bigger picture. I've got projects. The 500,000 Young People's Theatre has now developed without me. That's great. They're doing drama work there. You've got Chisenhale up in the north. You've then we established a music studio called the Steam Rooms, and we employed a musician in residence, Sean Tozer. So he was developing music within the area. And then as the immigration and more creative artists from Bangladesh, from Somali came in, we started developing projects, with their cultures. And it became a real hybrid. So that's why I say within 1978 to 1988, for me personally, but I'd also say for change within Tower Hamlets, it was the most exciting time in terms of the arts that you can actually get. I had a leader of the council and a chief executive who basically said to me, go on and do it, and we've got your back. Do not worry about the brickbats you're going to get from the old style councillors, because at first the councillors poo-pooed what Paul was doing and what I was attempting to do with all the arts groups, all the people involved in the development of artistic activity. But one of the strands that then Paul and I put in place, one Saturday every month, we would take members of all political parties in a minibus round the borough and took them to projects like Four Corners, camera work, Half Moon, where they met people, they met the creatives, they met maybe young people or people who engaged with the projects. And we did this over a year. And as it got towards the end of the year, more and more councillors got involved. And I can always remember one Saturday, we brought the whole council in to discuss the future of the arts. We got Pat Abraham from Greater London Arts to come down and talk, David Pratley to come down and talk from the Arts Council. I talked. And what was fascinating, the then deputy leader of the council, who was a real opponent of Paul, stood up in this meeting and then started what I thought was going to be a rant. And he went, I came here to have a go at you, pointing at me, to have a go at you, pointing at Paul Beasley, to have a go at the arts, etc. But I'm standing here saying that now I've actually been out, I've actually seen what is actually being achieved through these projects. You have my support. Well, that was like the turning point. I mean, that was suddenly we were getting our opponents on our side, and then money started to flow. So the council started investing more money within the arts, and my paltry 30,000 budget, which I first got in year one, I was getting hundreds of thousands of pounds to develop projects, many with a community or educational bias in the whole thing. So really exciting times.
One of the first things that I was thinking when you were talking was, you were talking about your own perspective on the arts and coming into Tower Hamlets, and how Tower Hamlets had this history of community-led projects. Tower Hamlets has a history of festivals. And I just thought to myself, the relationship between what those new dance practitioners at X6 and then moving to Tower Hamlets, what they were trying to do, were very much crossing over what you were also trying to do, and you touched on this as well. But central to what they were doing was really trying to challenge lots of things that were commonly accepted in or about society, to do with gender, to do with art itself. And in doing that, they were also advocating for, you know, or trying to strive towards a social and political change. And that seems really central to the work that you were doing as well. And so I can see now why that alliance between Chisenhale and Tower Hamlets was a natural fit, because you were kind of working towards the same things. And
absolutely. I mean, and I'm not going to claim, I think that one of the things that I don't think Paul Beasley has been given enough credit for is that he took a major decision way back early in the 70s that he believed passionately, and that the arts had a role to play within society and within local society. And that, you know, here is the old East End depicted, you know, the pub with the piano and people singing around the piano, and, you know, it's pearly kings and queens. But right from mid-60s into the early 70s, it also became a political cauldron. You know, the Isle of Dogs declared UDI and cut off, using buses, cut off the whole of the Isle of Dogs from the rest of the world. You know, there was so many political activities going on during our time. The, you know, the miners' strike, and then we had the Times strike, the journalists' strike, and then we had social workers' strike. All this is the backdrop to what we were all doing in terms of artistic activity. And we were trying to make sure that those two things were aligned at that particular time, because they were part and parcel of the same movement.
Yeah, yeah. And so you established those two initial community dance worker positions at Chisenhale for Mary Prestidge and Chris Cheek, and that was 1984. Chisenhale opened in 1983, but they had been doing some work before being publicly opened prior to that. And then in 1986, the GLC was disbanded. And like you say, there were all these other political things happening, miners' strikes, you know, the HIV pandemic. What was it like trying to forge those community links between Chisenhale, you know, relatively new in the borough, with the community?
From my perspective, Chris and Mary can only give their perspective. From my perspective, it wasn't difficult, because schools and youth clubs were crying out for activity, creative activity. So, you know, when we established Sean Tozer as the musician in residence, you know, we were inundated. We were inundated with young people wanting to get into the music business, or just play, and to find people who would actively encourage them in their work. So when you can actually see young people who've been through a process and been supported through that process and had their eyes open to the opportunities, and then to be able for them to still go, that was the critical moment that unlocked everything else that followed subsequently. There are so many young people that I meet who are now adults who go, that drama workshop you did with us, or that you taking us to the theatre, or us being able to perform at the Half Moon Theatre or at the Half Moon, made a real change to us. And that's what guides me to today, is mentoring young people, because they're the future at the end of the day. They're the future. They're the ones that will have open minds, open hearts. It was a no-brainer when we established the position for Chris and Mary, because Sean had shown the way. Sean Tozer had shown the way, that the impact we'd done. Then we'd done visual artists in residence. We had people like Ray Walker, who did a stunning project on sculpture at Langdon Park School. And he spent weeks being in the school and not doing anything. But when you say not doing anything, not creating, but he came to me with the idea. He said, I was saying, what have you learned through being in the school? And he said, the key moment is when the bell goes. And the bell goes, suddenly you have quiet corridors, and then suddenly madness erupts and people are running around everywhere. And he said, it looks like kids are running through the walls. So he took sculptures of different parts of the body of young people and placed them on interior, exterior. So you had a foot coming out the wall or an arm going into the wall or whatever. And it was fantastic. And you're going, and the young people just go, you know, they aligned with it. They understood it. They understood what he was doing. And they actively took part with all the sculptures were parts of bodies of young people in the school. And that's why I was saying it was so exciting, because in any one week, you know, I was dealing with Nick Sirota on developing the Whitechapel Art Gallery. I was talking to Chris Bond about developing, he did Sweeney Todd, which Stephen Sondheim says is probably the best production Sweeney Todd was ever done. You've got, you know, Chris and Mary, you've got Sean, you've got people all over the place doing, and I won't say I'm in the middle of it because I'm not, but I'm watching it all happen. And that's the most amazing, you know, moment. And when you get the other thing that I really wanted to do, and remember, this is, you know, Rock Against Racism, you had all the racist attacks in 75, 76, 77. You had Rock Against Racism, again, I think it was about 1978, trying to bring together all the various communities to unite to say that racism is not the way forward, etc. And we were doing music concerts that will bring together Irish groups with Bangladeshi groups, with Somali groups, etc. And the community embraced these concerts. And one of the things I learned, that whilst language can be a barrier, music language brings everybody together. It doesn't matter whether you're a musician from Bangladesh and a musician from Ireland, you can communicate through music. You can express yourself through music, but you can understand exactly the heart and soul of what you're doing in terms of creatively, etc. And those concerts were just some of the most joyous events where we did the melting pot, brought everybody together, and you go, that's what community should be about.
You mentioned that, and you know, during your time at Tower Hamlets, you know, the work that you were doing was becoming to be recognised, and as a result, you know, you got more funding for that. But I was just wondering at that time whether, like I mentioned, you know, the GLC was disbanded, and obviously Thatcher was changing arts policy and trying to move away from state-funded work, and there was, I guess, a tension within the Arts Council about community artwork because it maybe wasn't seen as high art. And so I wonder, you know, was that felt for you working in a council which actually was doing quite radical stuff and also maybe approaching art from a different perspective?
Yeah, but there was, so within the Arts Council and then subsequently within Greater London Arts, there was a fair degree of practitioners and bureaucrats who were not supportive of the kind of community arts movement. But that's fine, we understood that, but we also, I connected, so give one idea of how I worked. In Aldgate, English National Opera had their rehearsal studios. They're no longer there now, but they had their rehearsal studios. So I approached English National Opera, and I can't remember when this was, but it would have been late 70s. They were going to do Turn of the Screw, which has its central character, a young boy. And I asked whether they would be happy from the first rehearsal to the final, to the first performance, to let some young people from primary school follow through the production. So they agreed that we could bring 30 young people to the very first rehearsal. Jonathan Miller directed it. Okay, Jonathan Miller directed it, and I can't remember whether it was Sir Charles Groves or Maciras was conducting it. Anyway, we turn up with these 30 mixed race young people at Eno on a Saturday morning, and Jonathan Miller was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, talking to the kids, trying to explain what they were about, because they were going to be taken into the weirdest, wonderful world and over the number of months, the kids would come in and watch the production develop and meet the cast and talk to the cast and understand. And then we went to, and I remember this so clearly, we took them to the Coliseum for the first night. The kids were so excited, and not knowing the kind of the traditions of going to the opera, you know, they were so excited, they were chatting. And I can remember someone in the row in front of me turning round and saying, you know, you should never bring children to opera, kind of thing, which let off me laying off a tirade. And I put her in her place and I said, these kids have watched this show being developed from the beginning to the end. They're so excited. They are in the whole thing. We shut her up altogether because it was, and we then repeated it. I then got Michael Bogdanovich at the National Theatre to rehearse Macbeth in Limehouse Youth Club with 30 older secondary pupils, and they went and saw the production as well. And Bogdanovich afterwards said to me, he said, that has changed my way of working. That has to, he said, I'm frightened silly. All the actors were frightened silly of sitting in their first rehearsal with 30 young people, and they're watching us. And he said, that process that we went through changed me, changed the actors for the better. And I'm going, all these things you can do. Anyway, so there you go.
And I think, yeah, you just hit on something there, that it's not just about, well, from Chisenhale's perspective, it wasn't just about doing community work for the community. It was actually a two-way thing completely, and it was about developing their own practice and, like you say, developing the way that they were making work, thinking about work. It was an artist practice in itself, and that's really important. I think that's what made it successful, because you know, it wasn't just a sort of job. It was actually very much part of that whole collective working that Chisenhale was thinking about.
And a lifestyle.
Yeah.
A lifestyle. You cannot, you know, the way that we worked and the way that we played were one and the same. You know, this is really important. Where does work begin and where does life begin? You know, where the edges are so blurred that, you know, it's this, being an artist is not a 9 to 5 or a 10 to 6 job. Being an artist is a full-time occupation. You know, and that's what you've got to, and that's what I loved. I think the real creatives are the ones who passion are at their heart. They're passionate about what they're doing. They're passionate about what they're creating, and they're passionate on the impact they're having or creating or having back onto them through all those processes at the end of the day.
And if you had to describe what Chisenhale was at that time, how would you describe it?
Well, how do I view it? I remember the empty space. I remember the dance floor. I can remember all that. So I always think about, these are spaces in which creativity can take place, but it's not just about taking place in that space. It's taking the ethos of that space out into other spaces. That space was the heart of Chisenhale, and, you know, classes and performances. And I can always remember walking in, and it had an aura about it, which many old buildings and places do have. So it's an empty space for creativity. And you have to have a philosophy that is open. It's not didactic. It's not, you know, prescriptive. It's a place where people can come and create and can communicate through the language of dance or other forms of communication. But I have images of it. You know, it was such an imposing building in such a rundown part of the borough at times. but you know, it's become gentrified. You know, I still go in there, I still go around the Bow, but that's how I describe it, I think, at the end of the day. A place for potential.
Yeah. And that it's interesting that you use that word aura. Obviously you were talking about the physical building, but do you think that's also connected to people, or do you think it's no?
No, I'm agreeing with you. No, listen, if I love old buildings, and if the walls could talk, so let's start with an aura that was a warehouse, and I would have loved to have been transported back to the times when they were operating as a warehouse in Victorian times, etc. And all that history is embedded within the walls. When I go back to aura of Chisenhale, there is a continuum of life of that space, that building. That doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be a dance space. Life's ephemeral. You know, we're here for a short while. We're a little dot in the greater being of, you know, the world, etc. But projects like Chisenhale actually make an impact. They have an impact on not only the artists' lives, they have an impact on the lives of the people that they work with, they communicate with, they whatever. And that's what's, to me, so important. Change. Yeah. Positive change. Yeah. Where we can lead to a better world.
Yeah, and I guess that's what having a physical space gives you. It gives you the potential to sort of action, you know, and do things.
And what buildings do for some artists, that's their home. Yeah. That's where they're safe. They can experiment without fear. They can do, and it's the heart of the art. It's you know, and that's what's the fountain of creativity. And buildings are often so important in that, for some people, not for all, because some people don't need buildings to do creativity.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you very much for sharing all of your experiences with me.
Delighted.